Hey there, and welcome to That News You Care About, a weekly video game news show from the folks over at That Nerdy Site. Today is Monday, June 28th, 2021, and I'm one of your hosts, Logan Wilkinson. Joining me this week is my Phoenix son, Trevor Starkey.
Have you heard about these midichlorians, Logan? I hear
Nope.
I hear good things.
Nope. I hear nothing but bad things. In fact, I hear very little after the first movie, in fact. But no, it's all bad. Phantom Menace, okay, but not as some at That Nerd would have you believe, a movie that I love. Unfortunately, we are not, or actually, fortunately, we are not talking about midichlorians on this episode of That News You Care About. Yeah, it was kind of a weird week. I was actually spending yesterday and today kind of going through my, cycle of news sites and news kind of organizations in the video game industry. Bit of a slow news week, I think, after kind of the E3 highs kind of cooled off. But nonetheless, there was still some good news to be had. We're going to start off, Trevor Starkey, with a piece from Vice, dealing with Final Fantasy Remaster's reigniting controversy over pixel art. And we're going to kind of use this as a launching pad for a larger conversation around faithful adaptations of games and remasters. First off, Trevor, as the resident Final Fantasy expert here, Are you bothered by the new look of the Final Fantasy remasters? And just really, I guess, what are your thoughts on the Final Fantasy games from old being remastered in general? We'll start there.
So there's a few layers of it. Obviously, as somebody who grew up with the Final Fantasy games on the original like Nintendo and SNES into the PlayStation era and stuff, I have a very strong fondness for a lot of that original pixel art stuff. So much so that the Trevor Trove logo that I had was basically just Tella from Final Fantasy IV, but like palette swapped to look more like me, and I threw on pixel glasses and stuff like that. But it's pretty much I took the Tella sprite from like some pixel artist who had kind of recreated it, and then just like changed the colors and it, so like the silhouette of those two characters is the exact same. So yeah, I very much love the pixel art there. When the most egregious, I would say, example that has come out was when they remastered Final Fantasy VI, which, as we've touched on many a time, is one of my all-time favorite games. When they remastered it for Steam and for mobile devices, they changed the character models to move away from a pixel art-based sprite into a more animated sprite, like a little more cartoony kind of character design, much more smooth in its like layers and stuff like that. I mean, a much more like modern aesthetic. And for purists and stuff, there was a huge backlash. It doesn't bother me a ton. It's not a version I have really much interest in playing, but that's as much because it's on Steam or mobile as anything else. Like if that game were to be the version that were like released on like a PS5 or something, or a PS4 or like modern consoles, like even the Switch, I'd play that version. I would prefer, a more classic look of the sprites, but like I'd still play it because at the core, the gameplay is still going to be great. The music's still going to be great. There's still going to be a ton of like enjoyment there for me, even if it's
stories.
It doesn't have that look that I'm used to and that I'm familiar with. So like I've never been super on the like death to Square Enix train for this kind of stuff. That said, when they did like announce the Pixel remaster thing at E3, I got very excited for it, and then I got the rug pulled out from under me, as many did when it was like coming to Steam and mobile, and then later on even more so when they were like, and it's also not a collection. You're gonna have to buy these games separately. We're gonna do them all as like individual things. I was like, well, that's not what anybody's looking for. Looking at this Vice piece and seeing the comparison, I want to say RPG site basically went through and compared the original sprites from the SNES era to the
Yeah, that's what I was looking at.
2013, 2014 cartoony sprites that they've done, and then comparing to the new look that they're aiming for with the Pixel remaster. Like, the Pixel remaster looks very much to be like a blending of both worlds. It is,
Yeah,
like,
I agree.
if you take like A as the SNES and Z as the cartoony animation style, like, they're going for like somewhere in the MN, like right in the middle kind of range. It's the colors are brighter and more in line with the cartoony appearances and looks, but they are going much more for the pixel art style of and the pixel, like pixel by pixel blocks of the original SNES look. So it's like it's an interesting approach. And it is like appealing or trying to appeal to, all sides, as opposed especially because, on a modern TV, hey, yeah, it might be better if your characters are a little bit brighter than they would have been in the SNES era. One of the things this article really touches on a lot is the effect that CRT technology had on like the design, and how they weren't necessarily games were almost designed to take into account the CRT, like how they were going to look on a CRT device, not how they're going to look now on an HD TV, 20 years later or something like that. So it's interesting. Again, like, at the end of the day, the look isn't going to be the deal breaker for me. It's going to be, can I play these games? How easily can I play these games, and can I play them where I want to play them? Is what I'm much more interested in, especially because, like, if I really want to play Final Fantasy VI right now, I have the SNES Classic, and I could boot it up there, and that's probably going to be the best way that I could play it right now. Or I could, boot it up and play it on PC if I really, really wanted to, or something like that. So I think that's kind of the summation or the summary of really everything we're looking at. But yeah, for the other like piece of the puzzle is very interesting, especially on the Square Enix side of things, because obviously one of the kind of the real standouts that Square Enix has had in recent years has been Octopath Traveler, and the HD 2D design that they implemented with that, and have recently announced that they're doing like a Dragon Quest III remaster in that art style. That I think that almost would be more faithful to the pixel art style than just a straight, like, let's remake these games but with, a mildly updated pixel art thing. Like, I would sooner get an HD 2D and then putting in like that kind of work into these games, as opposed to potentially just kind of swapping in some assets for the character models and each of the different animations that those characters have, with the slightly brighter colors and stuff like that. So that's like, when I always think of John Phipps, aka Game Dad JP on Twitter, formerly Mr. Megative, because he is the other like big Final Fantasy VI person I know on the internet. And when the Pixel remaster thing got announced, we both kind of had the same reaction. When the HD 2D Dragon Quest thing got announced, we both had the same reaction of like, this means we could potentially get a Final Fantasy VI remaster in that art style. And that'd be great. And then they, ultimately seem to want to throw this idea out there and see if it sticks. So it's an interesting approach to the remaster aesthetic. And like, Square Enix just does very weird things, and I don't understand many of those 100%. Choices.
That's true. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this ties into, I think, the next question, which is just, how faithful to kind of strive to aim your adaptations. And, I mean, even think about it from, like, game to film, right? Like, I think of Sonic the Hedgehog, first and foremost, right? Of how, like, the original design wasn't, quote-unquote, good enough for the fans, wasn't accurate enough to that character, and then they redid it, right? Like, what you kind of try to thread the needle between these classic or not so classic in some cases games and characters, and trying to bring them into the 21st century, because like you said, the games are obviously made for CRTVs or just TVs or like computer consoles in general that weren't ever envisioned to be like HD, right? Like they couldn't ever envisioned what we'd have in 2021 when they were making the games in 94 or 91 or like 88, right? Or earlier than that in some games cases. And so I think trying to decide how to bring these titles into the 21st century and into, what is at this point now the third decade of the 21st century is a tough balance and act, perhaps, right? Like I think me and you are on the same wavelength where how it visually looks in terms of it being, an exact match for how it looked back in the day is not that important to me, right? Like I think like Crash, for example, I liked that remaster because they took that character and how he looked in 96, I think 97, and we're like, what would this look like in 17, 18, 19, right? They envisioned that character in the new millennium now and how he would look if the game came out today. And I think they did a really good job with that redesign, right? Or even something like Sonic Mania, right? Which isn't a remaster, obviously, but it's kind of bringing that character and that style and that kind of gameplay back into the 2017 world. I think really nailed that in a lot of ways. For the pros and cons, what makes a Sonic game. But I think there are oftentimes a lot of fans of really any series who everything has to be an exact match and an exact replica, and even the things that didn't work have to kind of be brought back in because that's what the game was. Whereas I'm much more like, look, if there was something wrong with the game, let's fix it now. And if there is, a better way to showcase the visual style of the game, I'm all for that, right? I want the spirit of the game, the spirit of the characters to be redone. That's, to me, what a remaster or remake is. But I'm curious to hear what your thoughts on that are as well.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, a lot of these, let's roll back. When we were talking about this before we started recording, I mentioned that I use the analogy, I have, not even an analogy, but I have an affinity and a nostalgia for the games and the experiences, not necessarily the inferior tech that we had. I'm not looking for the CRT experience like that. I'm plenty happy to, especially as I play through the NES classic games in that retro gaming series. These games still look like how I remember them, and whether that's because of the indie, space really leaning into pixel art style games for the last 10, 15 years, whatever it's been, that has kind of kept that fresh in our minds, or if it's just no, I mean, these games look clean now and they look like how I remembered them, especially as somebody who would be sitting, 6 inches from my giant screen TV in the game room growing up. I don't need the CRT scan lines. They're an interesting thing to have when you throw them into something like the Mega Man Legacy Collection, as you can play the game, with the clean aesthetic of this pixel art, or if you really want that nostalgia feel of playing it on an arcade monitor, or playing it not Mega Man necessarily, but your Street Fighters or something like that, playing it on an arcade monitor versus or your CRT home TV versus the more standard definition or HD looks of today. It's a cool little thing to do, but the analogy I used when we were talking is I don't want to play a game through a screen door. So don't put that on as a filter for me. I would much rather just experience the pixels and the design without those artificial lenses. It's one of the downsides that you often get if you really focus too closely on VR experiences, is because of the quality of those monitors and stuff. You'll see that screen door effect. I don't need that on a thing in 2021, especially as I'm sitting in front of monitors all day for work or playing games and watching movies and stuff. Anyway, I have zero interest in going back. That's not to say there aren't people that do like that and are hobbyists and have a nostalgia for the cathode ray tubes and stuff like that. I'm sure Jared Petty would love to play every old game in its original condition on a CRT TV or whatever. Yeah. But I also see people like John Phipps out there taking his Game Boy Advance and modding it to put an LCD high res screen on it that is brighter, that can play the Final Fantasy VI Advanced cartridge on a Game Boy Advance in a much better light without kind of like improving the old tech to meet, a modern standard or something like that. So that's like it's a novelty thing to put into a collection like that or into a remaster, but if you're not going to do like a straight like, hey, let's just kind of change, let's clean things up, let's make make it a remaster in the sense of like, hey, let's bring something from the old days so that you can now play it, and maybe it is a little brighter to account for the weird glares that you would have gotten on a CRT or something, whatever that is. Like, I'm cool with that. When it's something that is a more remake-ish style kind of thing, or more proper remaster, like your Crash Bandicoots. Like, I mean, I can't speak to Crash Bandicoot so much because I was never a fan of that series in the first place, but I thought they did a great job.
Yeah,
like taking it out of that very polygonal style into modern animation. Like, this is what this character would feel like nowadays. But I think really what people appreciate, or the same with like a Tony Hawk, like, is
that
those games feel like how they felt playing them in the old days, and the visuals is almost like a secondary element. Like, yeah, it's cool to have up-res visuals and stuff like that. Same with like Mass Effect recently. It's cool to have the original Mass Effect game feeling a little bit more in line with the later games in the series that fine-tuned and tweaked some things. But as long as it still feels like Mass Effect and you're not drastically altering that experience, I think you're probably going to be okay with a remake. Like, I want to say, was it the game 9? I feel like was one that like last year got just torn apart because of how bad of a remaster it was. Like, it looked worse than the original like PS2 game or something like that. I remember seeing some articles that were just like laughing the developers out of the building on what they were doing with those remasters. So it's you definitely can like botch it, but I think it's a pretty easy thing to do, is just kind of like don't break what wasn't, or don't fix what wasn't broken. In a lot of cases. I mean, I also think of all the things that THQ Nordic has like remastered in recent years.
Yeah,
like the SpongeBob Bikini Bottom game. It's like that's a weird shout, but people liked it, and if the remaster taps into a nostalgia and gets those people to pick up that game on a modern generation console so they can play it again, cool, awesome.
I mean, I think the thing for me is, you really touched on maybe the best example, which is Tony Hawk, which me and Frank have talked a lot about Tony Hawk Pro Skater because we love that series, we love those games, and I think one of the elements of that is how the Tony Hawk Pro Skater like 1 and 2 remake, it felt like how we'd always imagined those games feeling, right? Like it improved those games and kind of made our childhood nostalgic memories of them actually true, right, in a way. Like, it actually fulfilled what he'd always thought about those games, that if we had gone back and played them now, it wouldn't have kind of realized, right? And I think that, to me, is what you want from, certainly what I want from a remaster, right? It is to either reconfirm the game is still great, or, if it doesn't play the same way anymore, if it doesn't hold up because of just the mechanics and controls and how, those things have evolved over the last 10, 15, 20, 30 years, right? In some cases, 40 years, right? Almost, for like the original Mario Brothers game. It makes them be that again, right? Like, gives you an opportunity to experience it almost like you had for the first time because of it improved things, right? It gave it that lift again. Right? Like, it's kind of, sort of the conversation we have a lot about prequels. I feel like when me and you talk about prequels, is that like prequels are really hard to do, but when they're done well, they can actually make better the movie or book or whatever it might be that kind of they're being a prequel to better, right? In the same way, a remaster, to me, can make the original game better, right? It has the opportunity to, I think, flesh out and fill in the holes and fulfill the kind of the idea that they had back in the day that maybe they couldn't do either because of technical issues or the systems didn't exist yet, or like the system, it's the console itself literally couldn't manage it, right? Like they have the ability to do it now, and so that's what I want, right? I want that from a system, and then if it looks pretty too, that's great, right? But I am also not beholden to the way a game looked in 1993 or 1987 in Crash's case, or even 98, 99, 2000 in Tony Hawk's case, right? Like the most important thing is how the game plays and feels and how the story is told, and if those are all the same, we're off to the races, right? And I think Tony Hawk is kind of the premier example of a remake done really, or remastered. Those terms are essentially nebulous at this point. They're synonyms at kind of this stage in the video game industry. And so like that's kind of the game I looked to, being like, that game nailed it. That's exactly what I'd want to see done for all these other series, right? And then, as much as people might not like it because it is kind of bullshit, like, I think Crash did that for a lot of Crash fans, right? Like, if you liked Crash Bandicoot, or even if you just sort of liked him, like I did, that game was what you'd always envisioned Crash being, but wasn't any longer, right? Like, it made that game sort of playable again. In the same vein of, like, I would love to see what a, like, fully fleshed out remake of, like, GoldenEye 64 would look like nowadays, right? And they did sort of one for the Wii, but they also, like, kind of updated it and did, like, different story shit. But, like, an actual 2021 remake of GoldenEye 64 would, in a lot of ways, make that a video game that's playable, because the original one is sort of not at this point. And so, like, I would love to see that be a game, right, that we could bring back and make accessible to a whole new generation of gamers, right? Because that, to me, is, I think, what I want from any sort of remaster or remake, are doing games that, because of technical limitations and just how game design has changed over the years, are either kind of unplayable, are really hard to find, or really hard to access. And, the video game industry in general, I would say, is pretty shitty at preserving its history, especially anything pre, like, 2000, right? It's really dicey if you're not Mario, Zelda, or maybe Metroid, Final Fantasy, right? And so,
I mean, even Final Fantasy, like, famously wasn't getting remastered for a long time because people had lost the code and stuff like that. So
yeah, right. That's my point, right? The video game industry is like particularly bad at it.
Even after the 2000s, because there's one notable piece of DLC that's not included in the Mass Effect Legacy collection, and that's the Pinnacle Station DLC that was like on PC and then like on the original Xbox, and the code for that was just gone or so corrupted that they couldn't do anything. They would have to like rebuild that entire thing from the ground up if they wanted to include it for the Legacy collection. So it's just like, we're not going to put resources into that. I don't think people are going to miss it too much, was basically the ultimate thing. So if you still want to play that, you can still buy it on Steam. But yeah, they just couldn't recreate it because they lost the master code for it. The
that's my point.
Industry is littered with those kinds of stories. Absolutely.
Yeah, like, we're so bad at it, right? Which I think is why whenever I see like organizations that are committed to like the preservation of video game history, it makes me so happy, because this is an industry that is like so carefree about its history. It's so willing to just be like, it's fine, whatever, don't worry about it. And it's like, I want remakes and remasters to exist for that reason, right? So that we can actually preserve our history and make it playable again, right? Because I would love to play a lot of those kind of original games from like the 80s or even early 90s, right? When I was either before I was born or as I was being born and kind of growing up, like I didn't have access to an NES or SNES growing up, and so I didn't play. And so if they're not on the NES Mini or the SNES Mini, I haven't played them. But I would love to try more of those games out, right? Or even like the N64, which is a console that, like, in a lot of ways is just not user friendly any longer. I would love to be able to play more of those games again, but obviously,
I think that's where we get a lot of benefit from ROMs and emulators and stuff like that.
That's what I was going to talk.
They've done a good job really trying to kind of preserve a lot of those things. And I mean, even the games that NES or that Nintendo puts out on the NES Classic or the SNES Classic, or even like the Switch ports and stuff, a lot of times are emulators of their own games that other people have kind of like done the work on and salvaged and stuff.
Yeah.
That they're just kind of now like it's their intellectual property, so they can still claim it and basically resell it to people without doing that extra work. But yeah, it's definitely something that like enthusiasts have worked to try and do a better job of preserving oftentimes than the originals. You touched on something that kind of touched on something that I was also thinking about when you were talking about the idea of like if you can improve these old games because of like the original limitations, do that, and that's great and whatnot. I think of the Mega Man Legacy Collection because I would argue that is the definitive that is the definitive way to play those games now.
I agree.
And when I played them back in 2015 when that collection came out, it highlighted just how different I am as a gamer, as a player of games now in 2015 or now in 2021 than I was growing up when I had, afternoons after getting home from school where I could just kind of like bash my head against a wall playing through those levels over and over and over again. I'm just not interested in playing a pure Mega Man experience anymore. And, that game notably has like limitations of you can only have 3 bullets on screen in those first couple Mega Man games because that was all the processing power they had. If you try and shoot after that 3rd bullet, you have to basically wait until either it's hit an enemy or whatever. And like if they had created a mode of like here's the the remaster mode where you're not limited by the same limitations that the NES hardware had, that might have been a more interesting experience for me. I might have been, more eager to put more time into that. They did, they attempted to placate that kind of mentality by allowing you to do like quick saves and quick load kind of things.
That's what I was going to talk about.
Which has been commonplace in the emulator space since I remember playing like my first ROMs of like Pokemon Gold and Silver while they were still Japan only kind of games and stuff. Like I remember way back then that was just a feature that you had built into those programs. So it's like they didn't do a ton of work to add that feature in, but it definitely makes those games more manageable if you're like, okay, I know I'm about to enter a platforming area that's going to suck. So let me go ahead and do the quick save now, and then let me try. Oh, I died. Okay, rather than like waste that life, let me just reload the quick save function there, or I'm going to go into this boss fight and probably botch it. It's a nice feature to have. But yeah, it's like I think of Mega Man Legacy Collection and I think of Shadow of the Colossus as like 2 incredibly great remasters that just highlight how much I don't want to play those games. And in Shadow Colossus' case, in particular, because they remained faithful to like the original control scheme of those games, which
it's
like
rough.
Felt clunky at the time, and it still feels clunky now in the 2020s. Yeah. So like, but I can still appreciate that the people that love those games are getting to play those games with a great fresh coat of paint on. So yeah.
I think that's a great point. You've opened a can of worms here now, Pandora's box, that I really want to explore, which is, starting with the Mega Man Legacy Collection, right? I mean, we have to kind of address the fact, I think, if we're being honest with ourselves, that a lot of these older games that, you just need to get good, Trevor and Logan, right, were designed that way because either A, they were arcade games and they wanted your money, and so they were hard and unfair for that reason. Or B, if they were a console game, they were hard and unfair because they weren't actually that long, and so they're trying to make it a longer experience that was more worth your money, right? Like, you can beat Mega Man in, 45 minutes to an hour. You can just beat the whole game in, that long. But obviously, most people aren't going to do that because the game is hard as nails. And especially in the first few, if you don't, manage your, supplies and E-tanks and all that kind of stuff, you can just get fucked at the end of the game. You can get to the end of the game and have literally no way to win, basically. And so this is a mechanic that is just not good, I would argue. It's bad game design. And I think it's something that the
bad
Mega
game
Man
design
Collection,
for a modern audience, for a modern
100%.
approach. And
Yes,
also
100%.
another thing to just kind of, while I'm interjecting here, to keep in mind is we also had stuff like the Game Genie and cheat codes in that era
100%.
that no longer exists, and
then
they
Nintendo,
couldn't,
like,
they
Power
didn't
Magazine
replicate
with,
that
like, yeah.
experience. Yeah.
Yes. And I think for me, the Mega Man Legacy Collection sort of does like a half step, right? Like the introduction of saves makes that game way more accessible, right? Like it makes the game way more accessible while still being really hard and still allowing you to just screw up and not be able to finish the game if you mess up. But it makes that game easier in the sense that it makes it way more accessible to people who might not have played these games growing up and who haven't had the chance to get good and who don't have all of the tools you just said at their disposal to get good, right? And I think I would love to see games like Shadow and like Mega Man and like really all of the games from that era for fans of those games to kind of honestly let you reflect on the fact that like these games are hard for sort of businessy reasons in a lot of ways. And it's okay to allow, you know, that mode to exist and also a mode for, having maybe like a difficulty selection on Mega Man or having some sort of like other tools to make those games more accessible for people who were born after 1988, I think, for the first Mega Man game, right? Who just never played them growing up, right? Who were born in 95 or 96 or 2000 or 2010, right? Like, but who would still love these games. They could play them, but just the barrier to entry is so high, right? Like, I would love if that is this thing that they could incorporate well, right? Because there are so many classics from that era that if you didn't grow up playing them night after night after night, afternoon, kind of on repeat after school, because that's all you could do. You didn't have the internet. In some cases, literally didn't exist. And so it was either that or watching whatever might have been on TV, right? Like those are your options. And so I think,
and games were way fewer and far between. Like if you had Mega Man, that was the only game you were going to have, the only new game you were going to have for a good probably 2 or 3 months, because of either how expensive they were or just there were way fewer things coming out. So
there were no games. There was no e-store to just
put the
go
time
through.
into those things. Yeah,
exactly, right. And I think an acknowledgement of that, and acknowledgement that it, like, hey, like, if this is a series that you really love, if this is a character that you really love, you should want more people to be able to enjoy it, right, and access what makes these games and what makes these characters special. And so you shouldn't be trying to like die on the hill of it's got to be as tough as it was and it's got to be exactly the same. It should be like, what can allow as many people as possible to get what makes these games as special as possible, right? And to me, that is acknowledging, like having accessibility features for obviously people who either weren't around then or who maybe were around then, but whose either eyesight or hearing or any other sort of accessibility issue that has arisen in the time since and still want to enjoy the games they loved, right? Or people who obviously weren't around then, or people who just enjoy games but who were never good at them, but who would love to be able to experience all of Mega Man, but who just have never been good at hard platforming games like that, right? And in the same vein of like, I think that kind of era of video games is also partially hard, I think, to preserve because they're so hard. They're so obtuse in a lot of ways, right? Like I can get on my like soapbox again about the original Legend of Zelda game, but like that game wouldn't work. That game would absolutely have flopped in 2021 because people don't have time for something like that in the same way anymore, right? Like and they don't have the tools they had then, right? You don't have an instruction book in the front of the game case to help guide you on some of the clues. And I think that game would maybe be like a cult hit now, but it would not be a massive 40-year franchise. And I think an acknowledgement of that and an acknowledgement of like, hey, how can we make this game as accessible to people so that they can enjoy what makes the original Legend of Zelda so great? Because there are good parts of that game, but you have to work pretty hard to get to them at times. And so I think easing some of those rough edges to make it just simpler to enjoy the game for, their wholly original and groundbreaking game that it is only benefits the game and only benefits the consumers.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, especially with like the Legend of Zelda example, it would, if that game were released now, it would be a very niche kind of like a small 100%. Audience that really wanted to like dig into like finding all the secrets of that game would do it, and they would build out the FAQs just like they did kind of at the time and stuff like that. But yeah, even that game is a game that benefited from having a help guide at the back of the book. Where you could like call in and for $2.99 a minute or something like that get tips. So much so that they realized that game was going to be a problem, so they made a point to have that and have people staffed up and ready to kind of like guide people through those games. Another example I thought of while you were kind of talking is not even. I mean, it's partially an accessibility thing, but it's also just game designers and game developers they tried things and then they've like iterated on and found better approaches.
Yeah.
And so I think of a game like Grim Fandango, that when that got remastered a few years back,
shout out. Yeah.
they made a point to, if you really want to, you could still play with the tank controls to move around, but hey, we now have like dual analog sticks and we've come up with a modern idea of how to move these characters around using a dual analog system that isn't going back and thinking back to how a tank would move. So like figuring like allowing games to be like redesigned with that kind of mentality in mind of like, hey, yes, this was how we did it at the time, but that was just because we hadn't thought of these other better, newer approaches. 2020 is here, and we want to make this more approachable, so let's go ahead and put this into the terminology and the gaming lexicon of today. I don't know the Resident Evil series well enough to know if they did that on the remasters for Resident Evil as well, but I feel like that's been a part of the conversation in those original Resident Evil remasters. So that's just 100%. Another. I mean, like it's not accessibility so much as just the industry has kind of figured out a better way to approach a lot of those elements. So let's bring these old games up to the modern standard as opposed to keeping them in there for an arbitrary reason.
I think that's a great shout out, right? For Grim Fandango in particular, which is, I mean, really, those tank controls are something else. And for Resident Evil, right? Like 2 and 3 in particular, which are obviously the most modern remakes. I mean, all of the first Resident Evil games if you just play the actual original versions of them, are incredibly difficult to play now, right? They're very disorienting because, they're using these tank controls, and it's just, games aren't made like that anymore, right? And I think that's one of the joys of 2 and 3. And even, obviously Resident Evil 1 famously got remade too to make it way more accessible. They make the game easier to enjoy, right? Like that to me is always my big thing, is that like I go into every single video game I play wanting to enjoy it. And if it's hard to enjoy because it's hard to move, or it's hard to like see what I'm doing, or it's hard to like understand what I'm trying to be doing, that is only hurting both me and the game, right? So like anything that can be made easier in terms of me just enjoying the game. How can I enjoy this game? That's what I want to do. That's my goal. I think is a huge plus to any sort of remaster remake, right? And like Resident Evil games in particular, I think are a really great shout out because they sort of marry what makes those games special in terms of like its weird sense of humor, and obviously like the horror and the scares and kind of the zombie nature of it all, but also like the kooky puzzles and the fact that it's all sort of absurd and sort of self-referential. They understand that like this is a jokey situation, and they kind of lean more into that in Resident Evil 2 and 3. And they also lean into the fact that like these games are made in 2019 now, right? And like not 1999. And so how can we make that reflective of how these games should operate, right? Like one of the big shout outs to me is that you touched on is, the game industry has evolved and ideas have come into fashion and then out of fashion and back in and out, and ideas have been tried and worked and failed or succeeded. And more important than that, like a generation has kind of come in the wake of like the games that inspired them, and they know what they love about those games and they know what they don't love about those games. And I think that's part of what makes, for me, Sonic Mania work so well, is that it's made by such a huge Sonic fan. Like, there's a team there that loved these video games, and so they understood what worked with them. They understood what made these games click, and I think that's where you can kind of see some of the best remakes. And the same thing is true of the Tony Hawk game remakes, where it was, again, very clearly made by a team that loved the originals, and so I think they understood what made those games work, and they understood what made those games special, and they understood, I think, kind of the subtleties of Tony Hawk or Crash or Resident Evil or whatever it might be, right? Like they understood these games so well, and so they understood how to kind of bring them into modern times, into the 21st century, into 2020 or 2021. And that I think is also important, right? Because while you can bring back the original, dev team from the 80s, 90s, or early 2000s to do a remake, sometimes it's done better by people who played those games as fans and who loved those games as fans and who wasn't involved with them, because they're looking at it through a different set of eyes, right? They have a different perspective on what made that game special, right? Because sometimes, like in Star Wars, the original team might not necessarily always understand exactly what made it great, right? In a very real way. And I think sometimes it takes fans and people who grew up loving these things and people who were inspired by these things to really kind of get what works with it, whether it's Dave Filoni, whether it's Rian Johnson, whether it's J.J. Abrams, right? People who I think grew up with these things and maybe got it a bit more in modern times. And in the similar vein, I think the same is true for Sonic and Tony Hawk and Crash and all of these more modern games. I mean, hell, at this point, even Ratchet and Clank is probably a lot of Ratchet and Clank fans working on those games and not so much the original team anymore, right? Like, these are games that have kind of people have been able to grow up with and take what they liked about them and trying to make them more modern. And that, I think, is also a recipe for successfully bringing them into the 2020s.
Yeah, bringing it back around to the Final Fantasy conversation that really kind of kicked this all off, something that I've really appreciated that Square Enix has done in their remasters of like 7 before the remake, the actual like 7 remaster, as well as 8 and 9, and I think even like Final Fantasy 12, the Zodiac Age, has this kind of idea behind it, is they understand that people don't have the time and patience necessarily to grind anymore, and a lot of those JRPGs of that era, turn-based, role-playing games, were built around that. And again, that's another thing that kind of like artificially inflates the length and the time you're putting into those games, and doesn't necessarily abide by modern standards. So the fact that they put into those games like fast forward modes where you can basically play the game at, like, you tap a button and suddenly you're playing the entire game at ×3 speed if you really want to. It makes grinding through combat, and when you're doing that, a lot quicker. Or you can automatically, power up your characters or something like that. They've effectively incorporated quality of life things like being able to just kind of like work through those things quicker, or hey, if you just want to experience this for the story, turn on the no encounters mode, and you can do that, and you can enjoy that. Like, those are cool approaches that when I, booted up Final Fantasy VII for the umpteenth time, 5-6 years ago, like, I can play through that game, and what would have taken me 50 hours to play it on, like, the PlayStation 1, like, and now, like, just burn through the entire thing in 25 hours or something like that, because I know that story, and when I really want to slow it down and savor and enjoy those moments, I can. But when I just want to kind of like rush across the map from point A to point B, I can do that too. So I hope that when they work on these pixel remasters, that they keep that mentality in mind as well. And it's not just like, hey, let's give this a visual overhaul. Let us also remember to incorporate these, gameplay features that might make this a more enjoyable experience here in 2021, as opposed to, as you kind of touched on, like, getting in the way, getting between the player and the fun of the game. Like, do whatever you can to limit that traction and that resistance that can be a very natural, pain point. I hope on the Final Fantasy remaster side of things that they kind of continue what they themselves really, I think, were pretty good about as they approach some of their other remasters.
I think that's a great shout out, and it kind of leads me to the final thing I want to say on the topic, because it's sort of in line with that, which is, games like some of the newer Uncharted games. I'm pretty sure Last of Us Part 2, where they just have basically just a story mode where, like, the enemies are just, like, super easy to blow past, or in some cases I think there aren't even any enemies. You can just experience the story beats of the game and navigate the world. Again, just a way to enjoy the game if you're not that good at shooting, right? If you're not good at, third-person action-adventure games, but you really love the story of Uncharted or really love the story of The Last of Us, here's a way to enjoy that too, right? Like, I'm always, I think, going to be in favor of just lowering the barrier of entry to just enjoy the game, right? And giving people options, right? Some people want to play those games on crushing difficulty. Some people want, to experience the whole full 50 hours grinding of Final Fantasy VI, and some people don't have the time for that either, or don't want to do it, or aren't good at that, right? And I think giving people as many options as possible, I always support. Again, this goes back to me and Trevor's old horse about the Souls games as well. Just give us options. That's all we're asking for. Just give us some sort of options for those games. But I think that will, we won't go into that Pandora's box. We'll wrap it up there. That was a big topic for the show. We did it, guys. We have a couple of shout-outs, though. Actually, a few shout-outs. Trevor, we'll start with yours because yours is really interesting. And I had actually read the piece before you even shared it, so it was a good share as well. You've got, I think it's from Waypoint, right? It's from Vice. It's from The Gamer. My apologies.
Mine was from The Gamer, yeah. But then the Waypoint provided kind of an update. But before I dive into that, I will give a quick shout out to another great remaster from the modern era, even if it is one that I probably don't have much interest in going back to. But Demon's Souls was really good. It didn't do the things that we kind of talk about there of like, giving you options and stuff like that. But it was, for the fans who were looking for that game to come back, it delivered in a very strong way. It's there is like that hybrid approach of like, do we try and bring in a new audience like maybe a Crash did or something like that, or do we build this game and design it and really kind of get out there and say like, this is for people who like the old stuff, but now you have it just even that by the nature of that being a 60 frames per second kind of game, there is accessibility modes or something kind of inherently built into some of that stuff. But yeah, it didn't go nearly as far as I would have liked, but it for its own fans, they did a good job. Anyway, but yes, the proper shout out I have is the article that kind of made the rounds last week from The Gamer, and I kind of brought it up in our Slack with the context of, as a pair of white guys, we definitely shouldn't like dedicate an entire episode to this, but I did want to highlight it because I think it is an important story, and we saw some kind of traction around it across the industry. The Gamer went out and wrote an article called "The Sniper Ghost Warrior Press Event Made Me Pretend to Kill Arabs and I Hated It," by Eric Switzer, who talked about this press event for the game Sniper Ghost Warrior Contracts 2, that was basically it took them to like a shooting range where they do like anti-terrorism training and stuff like that. And it's the kind of thing that, I mean, like the article itself kind of goes into like, based on the fact that there's a Trump 2024 The Revenge Tour flag hanging from the building, you probably know the kind of people that the proprietors are and the kind of audience that this place is kind of catering to. But it's like it was I want to say it was like basically a rundown, it used to be a set for a movie studio kind of thing for Middle Eastern or whatever, village, something like that. And they basically brought a handful of press and influencers out there to do a training of like, hey, we're going to give you effectively like airsoft kind of guns, and we're going to train you to be a sniper kind of thing. And they had actors dressed up in very Middle Eastern garb, and this. The journalist from The Gamer, the enthusiast from The Gamer, kind of went out there and was very uncomfortable by the whole ordeal, as just kind of like the latest chapter in the very Middle Eastern, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim kind of bent that we see in gaming in general, especially in games like your Call of Duties and stuff like that. So it's just kind of become second nature that Middle Eastern guys are going to be the bad guys in these rah-rah US games because they've been the quote unquote bad guy in armed forces my entire life, pretty much. So, like it was a very interesting article that the company behind the game basically like read and was like, we are so sorry, because of the pandemic we weren't able to really vet this thing fully, and the developers weren't able to be there at the event to talk about the game. So there are like a whole bunch of things. Definitely check out the article, and then check out the either their own follow-up mentioning that the publisher apologized, or I'll link in the show notes the Waypoint article that says game publisher apologized for asking journalists to shoot people dressed as Arab stereotypes, because credit to CI Games, the company behind Sniper Ghost Warrior Contracts 2, even though their game is pulling kind of the pseudo garbage thing of like, it's a nondescript. We don't get into specifics of what, origin or who these people are, even though they rely on a lot of, again, the same kind of design aesthetics and stuff like that. They did, apologize for how this event was handled and all that stuff. So shout out to that piece again. Eric Weitzer or Eric Switzer, who got a whole bunch of crap from a certain segment of the audience out there talking about this. And then it also kind of opened up this conversation of like, what are appropriate press events? And it was really like, I think you guys are kind of missing the point around like what made this particular press event really bad. But yeah, so that was something. Again, as a pair of white guys, we are like not the best voices to hear and refer to this. I again point to like Rami Ismail, who I saw, saying a ton about this on Twitter. But I did want to highlight it here because I thought it was an important, piece that we saw in this last week.
Absolutely, I second that. It's a really wild read, honestly, just how kind of unhinged the event is. My shout out is because
it was like the game had already come out.
You could already play. He was already playing the game for like review,
post-pandemic thing. Yeah, he was already playing it for review. The game had actually released like the day before the event even. So like he'd already been playing it for review prior to that, but then it came out and then he went to this event. And at the event itself, they had like computer setup where you could play it, but they didn't even like allot time to play it. And like I said, the devs weren't actually able to make it out to be there for like a Q&A kind of portion. And it was really just this like quote unquote training exercise that really had some potentially offensive stereotypes associated with it. So it was a very wild write-up, and I appreciate Eric Switzer kind of sharing his experience and the discomfort that the experience made him, as opposed to just writing up, here's the press event I went to and here's what I thought of the game.
Agreed. My shout out is from Waypoint. It is Don't Piss Off Bradley, the parts seller keeping Atari machines alive, by Steve Kopferman. I'm going to say it and just run past it. It is a like long form feature. It's got to be like 2,000 words, 3,000 words about Bradley, who is pretty much like the sole or one of the sole provider of Atari machine parts from all different kinds of Atari consoles and machines and devices, and kind of his idiosyncratic, we'll go with, nature and persona, and just like the weird world of loving these old, again, going back to the kind of topic of the show, machines and consoles and devices and games, and only having so many options to help keep them running whenever they do inevitably kind of burn out because they're at this point 30, 40 years old, and kind of the few supplies and few suppliers that you can go to get them is a really weird, funny, great story, I think, that is so authentically video game. That's a video game-esque story if I've ever heard one. In ways both good and bad. And so, I encourage you to check it out. Also just because I love long-form video game writing, and that absolutely is one. So go check it out over at Vice, which is called Vice again. Go check it out at Waypoint, which is called Waypoint again, instead of like Vice Games. So that's exciting as well. Otherwise, I think that was the last shout out. Trevor, did you have any other shout outs?
Nope, that was it.
We're off to the races, guys. You made it to the show. Congratulations. Thank you for listening. If you like what you heard, you can go support us over at patreon.com/thatnerdysite, like all of our wonderful patrons and supporters have. Their support means the world to us and helps keep the lights on for shows like this and that D Plus show. Again, that's patreon.com/thatnerdysite. You can go check out all the tiers and goals and gadgets and whatnot, and join over there with all of the other supporters and wonderful human beings. You can also go to support us by going to a podcast service of your choice and liking, subscribing, sharing with your friends, rating, reviewing us on iTunes, telling all your grandmas and neighbors about us, and going over to youtube.com/thatnerdysite as well and hitting the big subscribe button as we continue our upward journey there, and go checking out the site at thatnerdysite.com. Otherwise, you can go find Trevor Starkey at Trevor J. Starkey on the internet. Trevor, anything you want to shout out?
Yeah, we talked about it a little bit at the top of the show, but I will shout out the That D Plus show that is continuing on our Summer of Star Wars. We did The Phantom Menace last week, which Logan was unable to join us because he had quote unquote car troubles. But
wow, weird.
you can
quotes.
hear the rest of us kind of point out the fact that Logan apparently really loves The Phantom Menace and particularly midichlorians. So go support that episode so you can, whether you love midichlorians yourself or you hate them, go let Logan know by supporting that episode.
Please don't. Yes, you can go check out that episode of That D Plus show. You can go find me at LeftyLogie, at LeftyLogie on the internet. I will also give a shout out to that D Plus show episode, but it'll actually be the one before that, when me, Trevor, and Cam all sat down to talk about Return of the Jedi. I thought that was a lot of fun. That was a really good discussion. The movie's really good. I really love Return of the Jedi. Really the whole, I think, Summer Star Wars series. I encourage everyone to go check it out. I can only speak for myself, but it's been a ton of fun. I've really enjoyed going back to a series that really does hold a special place in my heart and I love so much, with a couple of people I love as well. So go check that out. The first 4 episodes are up by the time you listen to this, and episode 5, which will be about Attack of the Clones, will go live tomorrow as of this airing. So that will surely
Friday.
be a mess. Oh, Friday, you're right. Yeah, it goes up on Fridays, not Thursdays. My apologies. But it'll be up 2 days after you listen to this. Otherwise, you can go find That Nerdy Site at That Nerdy Site all over the internet. And for myself, for Trevor, for all of us here at That News You Care About, That Nerdy Site.
For midichlorians.
The internet at large. I don't know about that one. Don't know about that one. For Jar Jar Binks, maybe. Play your games and be good to each other.